Good morning, I'm Maiki Oreta and you're watching Basis Points, where we dive deep into the numbers and the stories that drive our economy and shape our world. We begin with the opening figures at the Philippine Stock Exchange as we start a new trading week. Let's take a look at the PSEi. That index, not much movement today from the market. We're up by 0.1% to 66.52. Broader all shares up by as much, up by 0.1% to 36.13. Financials, industrial sectors, services, mining and oil are in the green, while the holding firms and the property sectors are down in the red, but not by too much, down by just about 0.5% or a little less. Now, to help us make sense of these numbers, we have with us Luis Limlingan from Regina Capital. Good morning, Luis, and thanks for joining us.
Hi, good morning, Mikey. Thank you for having me.
Okay, so Luis, we got a slew of economic data last week. We got, while employment and GDP figures surprised to the upside, inflation crept up to about 4.4% in July. The peso, however, did strengthen a bit, giving us some wiggle room. What do you think the BSP is going to do this week when they meet to discuss monetary policy on Thursday?
Well, I think 2 weeks ago, most bets were on the assumption that they were going to be cutting rates in August. But with what happened in both the US and Japan, and then as you mentioned a while ago, that the inflation crept up, it's not a foregone conclusion yet. So people are still a bit hesitant as to what the PSP is going to do on Thursday. Right now, if you had to ask us, we still think that they're going to push through with cutting the interest rates, given that they're working under the assumption that the change in both the food prices, fuel, and electricity is a one-off. And given that the peso has strengthened over the last week, it gives the BSP some leeway to cut rates and help push to their growth target of 6 to 7% for the year.
All right. So you're projecting a quarter of a 0.25 basis point reduction, perhaps beginning this Thursday. How much more for the balance of the year?
Well, again, I think it's going to be data dependent, because once they cut rates, I think they want to see what will happen moving forward. Will this help stimulate growth? Because the assumption is if you make the borrowing costs much more manageable, then I think the business will start availing of these loans. So will that also have an effect on inflation? Because again, as mentioned, the reading was 4.4%. Will it push? Will it push further? Given that now there's more flexibility in the lending sector. Of course, you have to watch out at what's going to be happening with regard to the Fed, because it is also assumed that they will be cutting rates as well in September. So afterwards, I think they're going to be watching how the economic data is going to be affected moving forward before I think they start cutting rates a second time.
That's correct. It's good you point that out, because when the U.S. sneezes, the whole world catches a cold. And in the U.S., there are fears of a recession now. So the Federal Reserve there is really, they're inclined to cut rates. Now, how can we position, how can Philippine investors position for a lower interest rate environment here in the Philippines and in the U.S.?
Well, I think the first thing is just keep note of the dates. So the first meeting is going to be in August, and then usually it's around 6 weeks afterwards. But again, if you're a businessman, look at the meetings of the BSP. That's one. Second is also to look at the inflationary data, because they're going to be basing a lot of their decision heavily on that. Second is also what the US is also doing. So when we release our inflation during the first week of the month, the US follows during the second week of the month. And of course, the PSP and the Fed, they usually meet around on average every six weeks. So you can, if you're a businessman, try to keep note of those dates so you can actually time it. And probably keep a tabs as to what the market is assuming, right? It's not always correct, but if you can you can also gather probability that there's going to be a likelihood, then you can time it as to whether you should be borrowing ahead or after the meetings of the BSP.
And with the rate cuts, that's going to benefit the banks, that's going to benefit the property sector. How much upside potential can you expect? Right now, the PSE index is at 66.52. What's your year-end target for the PSEi, and how much upside would that be?
Well, right now it's a moving target, and given all things being equal, and that's assuming that they're going to be cut. The BSP is going to be cutting rates in August, the first cut, and then the Fed is going to be following in September. And hopefully, both inflation in the US and the Philippines are within the acceptable range of both administrations. Then we're looking at around 16. Now, what could push this forward? I would say better earnings, better than expected growth in the third quarter. And if probably the prices of goods such as electricity, fuel, food, they're all manageable, then maybe we could challenge 7,000. But for right now, we're keeping our assumption for 6,800.
All right, it'd be nice to see the market challenge 7,000. Now, for the foreign exchange market, seasonally, as we get towards the end of the year, the peso strengthens. How much upside are you expecting on that end?
Well, we're hoping that if the BSP cut rates in August and it doesn't really have great of an impact in inflation, then probably the peso would probably trade between 57 to 57. Now again, if the inflation creeps up, then that's going to add more pressure on the peso, and it could, slowly make its way back to 50. But again, we have to consider that the Fed is also moving, right? So will they be cutting rates as expected, or will they be pushing back? That could also bring some upward pressure on the peso. So all these things are probably just going to come into play, and that's why we've seen that the peso has appreciated so abruptly as we did last year.
Okay, now going back to the U.S., Republican presidential nominee Donald Trump has said because he has run successful businesses, he should have a say. If he becomes president, he would like to have a say in the decision of the Federal Reserve when it comes to interest rates. What do you think about this? Do you think that central banks should maintain their independence? What's your take on the situation, Luis?
Well, I think central banks should really safeguard the interest of the public, and that is really to keep inflation manageable, to make borrowing competitive with respect to their countries, and make sure that the currency is stable. Now, I think at a certain point, they can probably take into consideration what the president and the administration have in mind moving forward. What are their policies? But I think at the end of the day, they should be mindful that this is really the reason. This is really what they should be safeguarding, the interest of the public.
All right. Okay, Luis, last question for you. Best investment advice anyone has ever given you. Can you share that with us this morning?
There are a lot right now, but I think probably one I can just contribute to the audience at something they haven't haven't traditionally heard from is, I mentioned already, one is that you have to keep note of the dates of the calendars, because and the calendar of events, the market doesn't move arbitrarily, so they move according to what the data comes out. And I think the second piece of advice I would have to give is, after you know the date of when economic events or data is coming out, I would say look at what the market is pricing in. So the market, even if the data might be good objectively, you could see that the market could be selling or reverse, right? Even if the data isn't as good, then you can see the market is buying back, because there is always an underlying projection or assumption given by the market. Just what I mentioned a while ago in terms of, for example, with the Fed and the BSP. So keep this in mind when you're investing. One is to look at the dates, and two, what is the market pricing in. So I think given that, it will help you have an advantage over the others who are not, who are not as, I guess, diligent in keeping tabs.
All right, thank you, Luis Limlingan from Regina Capital.
Thank
Now,
you.
in other news, the country's gaming industry is on a roll as revenue surges by 32% in the second quarter of the year. Now that's to 89.23 billion pesos on the back of growth in the e-game sector, which generated 30.85 billion pesos. The Philippine Amusement and Gaming Corporation, or Pagcor, says the jump in e-games revenue is crucial following the government's total ban on Philippine offshore gaming operators, or POGOs. Now, on the downside, however, Pagcor noted a slight dip in the revenues of traditional casinos and bingo operations. The agency, however, says that the overall market is still thriving, bolstered by digital gaming. Let's take a look at the business headlines in the major news websites. On Business World, analysts believe that the Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas may cut rates for the first time in nearly 4 years at its policy-setting meeting this Thursday, August 15th. A poll by the organization shows 9 out of 16 respondents expect the Monetary Board to deliver a 25 basis point rate cut. Now, meanwhile, the BSP expect the BSP to keep rates steady. Now, on Inquirer, some 45 projects funded by Official Development Assistance, or ODA, have been classified as problematic. That's according to the National Economic and Development Authority, or NEDA. The agency says this is mainly due to the challenges in right-of-way acquisition procurement issues and regulatory compliance. These difficulties were further compounded by health and logistical restrictions during the pandemic. And on CNBC, the Paris Olympics and Taylor Swift's Eras Tour are causing a surge in prices. That's as demand rises for hotels, airline tickets, as well as other goods and services needed by tourists. But investment banking giant UBS believes that most consumers may not feel the impact of that price surge. And that's it for Basis Points. I'm Maiki Oreta. Stay tuned tomorrow for news on the financial markets and more. Keep it here on BNC, the Bilyonaryo News Channel. Executive Insights is up next.